Gentlemen, it's now 7 o'clock and time for the regularly scheduled Beloit City Council meeting at 100 State Street, Beloit, Wisconsin. It is Monday, July 16th, 2012. First order of business is call to order and roll call.
Roll call shows Councillor Van de Bogart absent.
All right, item number 2 is the Pledge of Allegiance. Let's all stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Third item is special orders of the day and announcements. There are none today. So on to number 4, is public hearings. Item 4A is a public hearing to solicit input for the community development, housing and homeless needs for the City of Inclusion in the 2013 Annual Action Plan and the resolution approving the 2013 Community Development Block Grant local funding's priorities. Councilor DeForest has recused herself and will return after this item has been matter's been handled. Mrs. Christensen.
The Department of Housing and Urban Development requires that we give the public an opportunity to give input on what they feel are the public housing needs, community development needs, homeless needs, and housing needs in our community as we start to prepare the annual action plan, which is the document that we are required to submit to HUD in order to get our community development block grant funding. As part of that process, we took to the CDA a resolution asking if they would like to recommend funding priorities for the 2013 CDBG grant cycle. And at their last meeting, they did decide to recommend funding priorities, which are included in the resolution, which is in your packet tonight. And what their recommendation was that the funding priorities for public service programs be to help those that will help stabilize neighborhoods by keeping people in their homes, with priority given to innovative evidence-based homeless assistance programs, foreclosure prevention, credit counseling, financial counseling, and utility assistance, and then additionally code enforcement, housing rehabilitation, economic development activities, with priority being given to microenterprise assistance, and then program administration and fair housing. Once you approve the funding priorities, whatever they will be incorporated into the 2013 CDBG application, which will be made available tomorrow. We did send a public notice out to all of our CDBG mailing lists to give them the opportunity to know that this public hearing was happening. There was a notice also published in the Beloit Daily News. And then the applications will be available tomorrow, and then that'll kind of kick off our CDBG grant application process.
Thank you. I now open the public hearing on item 4A. Does anybody wish to speak on this matter? Please state your name and address.
My name is David Zimdars, 2086 Pioneer Avenue. I'm here representing the Voluntary Action Center and the program that we run under our aegis, the Beloit Shore Service. We do receive CDBG funds to do that, and we would encourage you to continue to give full consideration and funding to that very program. For the simple reason, by the way, it's my first time before you as the executive director, so if you were expecting Lynette Newton, who was probably here last time, I'm not her. But, but we both feel very strongly about preserving this program, and trust that you will see to it that it receives proper funding. It does help the city to maintain its property values in as much as we help seniors maintain and keep their homes, everything from lawn mowing and maybe even a little gardening, to changing their storm windows and such details, housekeeping even. It does minimize the possibility that a senior would simply give up on maintaining their own home because it was too difficult for them physically, and then turn it into a rental property, which is obviously a less desirable situation for the city. It does help in general to keep the housing in better condition, since we do offer repairs, and since those are offered by independent contractors, We're also able to utilize and employ a significant number of, well, we don't employ them, but we keep a number of underemployed and unemployed people working, helping out the seniors at reduced cost. It obviously promotes self-sufficiency among the seniors, those who are home owners and property owners. Helps them to stay in their homes for as long as possible, even when they are even just slightly past that ability to take care of the property themselves. So it allows them to stay there both in safety and with some dignity. Keep it short and sweet, and that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other persons wishing to speak on item 4A? One final call for any other persons wishing to speak on item 4A. Hearing none, I'll close the public hearing on item 4A and entertain a motion.
Make the motion. Second.
Motion by Kincaid and second by Lukey. And any counselor questions or comments? Hearing none, I'll call the matter. All in favor of approval of this resolution, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Item passes 5-0 with one abstention. Next item on the agenda is item number 5, citizens' participation. I do have one sign-up sheet from Deb Crockett.
Hi, I'm Deb Crockett. I live at 1014 Emerson Street, and I'm here with the Beloit Backyard Chickens Group. You know, we really appreciate all the work that the staff and counselors have put into considering this. We know that there are some staff members with some pretty deep concerns, and we've been doing a little bit of research to have some answers to some of their concerns. So one of the things that we've done is we've identified several farms that are willing to take abandoned chickens, and we have members of our group who would be glad to transport them. So I've got a letter here from one of those farms, and then we have some others that we can get to you pretty soon. In terms of helping to promote best chicken practices, I have letters from 2 different local community organizations, from a nonprofit that's glad to help with education, and also from a church which would be glad to do education and community outreach to the Latino community in particular, as well as to translate anything. And then the final thing that I wanted to share with you is just in terms of doing outreach to the community, we offered, I think, to all of you before in a letter that we're glad to develop pamphlets, and one of our newest group members went ahead and did a draft. So we realize this is a draft and that nothing is passed, but it's something to start working with, and we're glad to, do any other work like that that's needed eventually as well. So I just wanted to share all of this with you, and we're hoping that, that the ordinance will come to a vote soon. So, thank you.
Thank you. I have no further requests to speak, but anyone else who's wishing to speak at citizen participation, please come forward. One final call for persons to speak under citizen participation. Oh, it was easy for me to say. Exactly. Yeah, it rains on my brain. Sorry about that. Okay, so therefore I'll close the item number 5. Then item number 6 is the consent agenda. All items listed in the consent agenda are considered routine and will be enacted by one motion. There'll be no separate discussion under one of these items unless a council member so requests, in which event they will be removed from the general order of business and considered at this point on the agenda. The consent agenda consists of items 6A through 6E. Does any councilor wish any of these items removed from the consent agenda? Hearing none, I'll entertain a motion to approve the consent agenda.
Second.
Moved by Levy and second by Spreitzer. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Item passes 6-0. Number 7 is ordinances. 7A is an ordinance to amend Sections 13.05, Parent 3 of the Code of General Ordinances of the City of Beloit relating to overnight parking permits for residents of Business Improvement District. This is coming up for a second reading. Mr. Casper.
We did have a general discussion of this at the last regular council meeting on the first reading. There are a few things I'd like to re-review, and I want to emphasize that this ordinance does not deal with on-street parking in any fashion. I've had a few questions about that. It makes no changes whatsoever to the on-street parking. As far as the city-owned lots in the Beloit Business Improvement District, where it does have some impact, it will not allow holders of these permits to park in time-limited stalls, such as a 2-hour stall, a 4-hour stall, and overstay the time limit. They can still park in those stalls, but it has to be for the 2 hours or 4 hours, whatever the stall is posted at. It's probably unlikely that many of the permit holders would be using those stalls unless they're visiting another business at a lot some distance from where they normally keep their car. Lastly, I just wanted to make sure the record reflects that the councilors were presented with the email correspondence from Mr. Godfredson and my email back to Mr. Godfredson, where he discussed some of his concerns, and I attempted to address those. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
All right, I think we'll get started with a motion.
Second.
Motion by DeForest, seconded by Levy. Councilor DeForest.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Casper, I just wanted to address one of the items that came up by Mr. Godfredson about limiting the amount per parking lot. Do you foresee that as an issue at this point?
We don't collectively, but it's very hard, I think, to predict the future on this, not knowing exactly what the usage is going to be at the Phoenix project, not knowing if it is college students, not knowing exactly how many of those might choose to bring cars with them to school and keep them downtown. I think it's a type of ordinance that council's likely going to want to revisit, and staff would bring back to revisit if unanticipated issues start developing. I mean, as I indicated to Mr. Godfredson, I think you folks and staff try to continually balance the needs and desires of the downtown business owners and users of those businesses versus upper floor housing, which we're also trying to encourage. So
it would be fairly easy to revisit this if need be.
It would, and as far as, just as a side note, the fee would be revisited on an annual basis in any case. That was another one of his concerns.
I saw that. Thank you.
Any other councilor questions or comments? Mr. Vice President.
Mr. Casper, do you have any concerns that during particular festivals or other downtown events where we have a lot of parking anyway down there, that we may have issues, particularly if people are leaving their cars for extended periods of time in these spots?
I don't know that I can add more to what I responded to Mr. Forrest. I think we are going to have to see how this plays out, how heavy the usage is of the permits. The current permit scheme has not been taken advantage of to any measurable extent. I think we anticipate that this one will be. There will be more of a desire for these permits, particularly so if the college takes a lease on those upper floors. And as that usage history becomes apparent, I think if there are problems, we'd be back sooner than later asking for some modification or fine-tuning.
And a question for the city manager, in light of not just the Phoenix project, but our discussion earlier about upper floor housing in general, do Has there been any thought given strategically to whether we might down the line need additional parking in the downtown if this becomes a significant residential area? And if so, if there are any options for providing that?
Well, there was considerable discussion a few years ago about adding downtown parking. Unfortunately, we're not able to work out the location. We had a spot we could have put a parking garage in. At this time, we have very adequate parking downtown, even support some festivals that are outside of the immediate downtown area. Some of it is maybe not in the best spot for each individual business, but there seems to be plenty down there. We envision with this a dispersal. First of all, if the college takes the Phoenix project, we're not sure even how many permits there will be. Not every student will have a car, obviously. And again, we approved a supplemental appropriation a little earlier this evening to allow for the construction of more second-floor housing in existing business properties downtown. And again, it's hard to tell what the composition will be of those residents and how many automobiles there will be that'll need parking space in downtown. So I think, this is a good framework for how to work it. It opens it up so we can deal with the second-floor housing issues. If problems result, we can bring it back. It's a relatively simple matter to draft amendments to it and bring it back.
Thank you.
Any other councilor questions or comments? Hearing none, I'll call the question. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Item passes 6-0. Item number 8 is appointments. We do have some today. The undersigned Charles M. Haynes, duly elected president of the Beloit City Council, subject to confirmation by the Beloit City Council, does hereby appoint the following citizens to the members of and vacancies and terms indicated below. Said appointments are being pursued, but to nominations made by and approved by the Appointment Review Committee at their regular meeting held July 9th, 2012. The appointments to the Municipal Library Board, John Watros, 805 Church Street, replacing John Mitchell for a term ending June 30th, 2014. To the Parks and Recreation Conservation Advisory Committee, Carol Manekowitz, 636 Harrison, replacing Christopher Brown for a term ending September 30th, 2012. And Teresa Oldenburg, 2410 Cliffhorn Drive, replacing Michael McNulty for a term ending September 30th, 2014. I have a motion for approval of these.
Second.
Motion by Lubke, second by Spreitzer. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The appointments pass 6-0. Also, I'd like to announce the following vacancies. To the Alcohol Beverage Licensing Control Committee, we have 2 vacancies for residents. The Board of Appeals has 2 vacancies alternate for residents. Board of Ethics has 1 vacancy for former city councilor and 1 vacancy for resident. Board of Review has 1 vacancy as alternate for resident. Community Development Authority has 1 vacancy for resident. Disabled Parking Enforcement Assistance Council has 2 vacancies for residents with disabled plates. Equal Opportunity and Human Relations Commission has 1 vacancy for resident. Municipal Golf Committee has 1 vacancy for youth representative. Municipal Library Board has 2 vacancies for residents of Beloit or towns adjacent to the city. Park and Recreation Conservation Advisory Commission has 1 vacancy for youth, and the Traffic Review Committee has 1 vacancy for resident. If you have any interest at all in serving your city in this capacity, I would advise you contact the clerk's office and we certainly love to have you. Thank you. Item 9, councilor activities and upcoming events. Councilor Lukey.
On Thursday, the Wisconsin Circuit Criterium event came to Beloit, the bike race, and we had somewhere around 150 bike racers in various categories race from 10 in the morning to about 8 at night, and it came off very well. I was very pleased with the public works setup. The police department was wonderful. We had about 75 volunteers helping all day. I heard at least a half a dozen unsolicited comments from people from around the area, I should say around the country, world. The winner of the men's race was from South Africa. The women's race was from Colombia. Colombian national champion. So we had people from all over the world here, and the compliments were all positive. I heard nothing negative from any of the spectators or participants. This was pulled off by the city in a matter of a few months. We were invited to have this, and Beloit put its mind together, and we did this in a few months. So next year in July, we'll do this for a second time, and hopefully bigger and better, and bring more people to Beloit to admire our wonderful city. So thank you, Mr. Jacobs, for your wonderful cooperation, and Mr. Arf, the city did a great job of helping us. That's all I have.
Thank you. Councilor DeForest.
Thank you, Mr. President. One of the highlights of my week was participating in the Parks and Rec tour, and I just want to extend my appreciation to the Parks and Rec staff for the work they do. We have exceptional parks for a city our size, and couldn't be prouder to live in a city that understands the importance of having park space for our residents to enjoy. I've also enjoyed the farmers market the last 2 Saturdays despite the heat, and other diehards were out there with me, and that's of course been fantastic. Thank you to the vendors who make that event such a huge success. And I'd like to share that I look forward to traveling to Jefferson County on Friday to participate in the Rock River Trail initiatives, continued preparations and plans to attain federal designation for the Rock River as a national water trail. I'm on that advisory council, and it's been very labor intensive completing the federal designation application, but I'm proud to be a part of that. Thank you.
Councilor Levy.
No, I have nothing.
Okay. Councilor Kincaid.
Not this day.
Councilor Spicer.
I too participated in the parks tour, and it was a fantastic event. Got to see a lot of parks that I had seen before but hadn't spent that much time looking at, and as well as a couple of new ones that I hadn't seen before. So a great opportunity to see all the fine work that's been done, and also to talk about future improvements.
Thank you. And I have nothing today, so that will end item 9. Okay, number 10 is the city manager's presentation. But before we move on to the item 10A, I believe that the city manager wanted to discuss our special meeting that we had just prior to this.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yes, councilors asked me to explain to the community and the viewers at home why there was a business item included on a workshop agenda that was set up for the time period from 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. prior to the regular city council meeting. This is not unprecedented, but obviously we do our very best to make sure that all routine items of business or general items of business are included on regular city council agendas, which are done and televised to the community so everyone of interest can watch the proceedings. Unfortunately, last week we had literally a last-minute item came up when the Downtown Beloit Association notified the city that they had received a number of applications for upper floor housing well beyond what had been anticipated, what had ever been received in prior years, and they wanted to try to process all of those applications and approve all of those grants before the TIF expenditure period closes, which happens on September 26th of this year. The only way we could do that was to come back to council and ask for a supplemental appropriation, even though this is TIF incremental revenue, not general purpose tax revenue. Obviously, all the expenditures have to be pre-approved by the city council. Unfortunately, there wasn't time to get all of the documents together to have it on the regular agenda, which must be published by law, by city ordinance, on a Wednesday afternoon. So we did it as part of the special meeting agenda because we only need a 24-hour notice on those special meeting agendas, and we had more time to accumulate all of the documents. And actually, I think, again, kudos to the clerk's office. I think they got all that stuff put together and out pretty much by late Wednesday, early Thursday in any event. But that's the reason why the supplemental appropriation to extend the upper floor housing initiative funding was handled as part of that workshop and not included on the regular city council agenda. If councilors have any additional questions, I'd be happy to answer those. I guess I should add that it was approved unanimously.
Yes.
Council, as we were very excited to see this level of interest among our downtown property owners. And another component of this, which wasn't part of the resolutions, we also received a significant number of applications for facade renovation projects. So you'll see a lot of facade work going on the outsides of buildings downtown throughout the balance of the summer, and then the upper floor housing remodelings, of course, will be taking place concurrently as well.
Thank you, City Manager. Okay. Now we'll move on to the item 10A, which is the 2011 audit report presentation. Mr. York.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of council. It's our pleasure this evening to present to the City Council the financial audit report for the year ending December 31, 2011. We did complete this report toward the end of June, 1st of July, and it has been posted to the city's website for those that are interested in reviewing this report. I would certainly encourage everyone to take a look at it. It has a lot of information about the city's finances in there. And with us this evening, we have members of the audit team here. Carla Gogan, she's the partner in charge of the audit with Baker Tilly. And with her is Joe Lightcap. He worked on the audit. And Jody Dobson, she works with the group that audits our utility funds. And they're all here to give a presentation and to go over the highlights, financial highlights with the council and the public, and the results of the financial operations for last year. And with that, I'll turn it over to Carla.
Good evening. Thanks for having us here tonight. As Paul mentioned, I'm going to cover the financial statement highlights from the city's perspective, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jody, and she's going to cover the utility highlights, and then Joe will wrap things up with the report on internal control. We welcome questions tonight, or if after tonight's meeting other questions arise, do not hesitate to reach out to us directly or feel free to pass your questions through Paul. First, just want to thank you. We know you have a choice in service providers, and we appreciate the opportunity to work with you. Staff has been excellent to work with and certainly do a tremendous amount of work in pulling the financial statements together. So to echo Paul's comments, certainly encourage you to review the document, and if nothing else, reviewing the management's discussion and analysis, which is drafted by management. It's in the front portion of the comprehensive annual financial report, and it does a nice job of providing summary information of financial statement highlights of the city. Tonight we're going to focus on the report to City Council, which we have up on the screen for those in attendance, as well as you should have received a copy of this in your packet. All of the information contained in this report can be found in the financial statements. What we'd like to do tonight is go through some of the financial statement highlights together. I do want to start by saying, though, that as part of the financial statements, what you hire us to do is to provide an opinion on the city's financial statements, and as is in the past, we've provided an unqualified opinion, which is the highest level of assurance that you can receive in a financial audit. With that, we're going to start to go through the financial statement highlights. Focusing on the general fund. The general fund, as you know, is the primary operating fund of the city. And what we like to do is take a look at fund balance. This is the first metric we're going to look at. We take a look at fund balance, which is essentially anything that's left over. So if you take the assets of the general fund, which is primarily cash and investments, receivables, and you subtract from that the liabilities, payables, in the general fund, what you're left with is your fund balance. And there was a change in auditing or in accounting standards this last year. So how fund balance is categorized, or the terminology related to fund balance, has changed. The first three lines, reserve, designated, and undesignated, that's terminology that we had previously referenced quite often, with undesignated fund balance being essentially funds that were uncommitted, or they were not designated or reserved for any particular purpose. GASB has now provided new terminology, the goal of providing more consistency from government to government, and the categories do align with what you've seen in the past, and those categories are non-spendable fund balance, which means it's not in spendable form. So this typically means it's items that are not liquid. You have about $1.7 million of non-spendable fund balance. And the largest items related to that is inventory that you have in the general fund. So that's just, again, not something that you could readily liquidate. Prepaid assets, so these are things that you've paid for before the end of the year, but it's really an expense or an item that relates to the subsequent year. And then advances. The general fund will advance funds to other funds within the city, some interfund loans. And again, because it's an advance, it's considered long-term, that other fund that the city has loaned or advanced monies to doesn't have the ability to pay that money back within the next year typically. That is related to what you've previously referred to as reserved fund balance. Assigned fund balance, usually that is spendable. It's usually, again, council has identified this and assigned the funds for a particular purpose. And in this case, these are monies that were applied to the 2012 budget. And this relates to designated fund balance. So if you think about things that you had designated fund balance in the past, it's a correlation between the two. And then what you're left with is unassigned fund balance, which is, again, assigned or available for spending at your discretion. And you have about $8.4 million of unassigned fund balance. Again, one of the metrics that we look at is we take the unassigned fund balance and compare that to next year's operating budget. So in this case, it's the unassigned fund balance as of 12/31/11 and compare that to the 2012 operating budget for the general fund. And the city's policy has been the greater of 15% of operating revenues or 3 months of estimated expenses. And what you have is about 3.6 months of operating expenses. So you're exceeding what your policy states. You're at about 28%. So certainly very positive in terms of meeting that metric or that benchmark, which certainly is not easy given the current economic environment that we're working under, and certainly the dependency on tax revenues, as you know, and intergovernmental fund revenues. The next benchmark we take a look at, or information, is summarized income statement. And you can see that you had a slight net loss, again, just in the general fund for the year, $24,000. But what's to make note of here is that the city had actually budgeted a deficit in the general fund. So the city had budgeted to use or spend down approximately $600,000 of fund balance, and in actuality you spent down about $24,000. So I think that's the noteworthy item here, which primarily was due to expense control. There were items or vacancies in public works and public safety which were not filled in 2011, and also lower snowfall totals than what had been budgeted for. So that is certainly, again, very positive financial results for the general fund. The next metric that we look at is general obligation debt, which general obligation debt is secured by the taxing authority of the city. You have other debt, such as revenue bonds, which is secured by the revenues. Typically, that's in utility funds. So general obligation debt outstanding at the end of the year of $61 million. If you break that down, just over $5 million, or about $5.6 million, is related to the enterprise funds. And about $55 million is related to city purpose activities, so things in your capital project fund, certainly your TIF districts. So if you're borrowing for projects, that's typically going to be a lot of general obligation debt. And we take a look at the percent of debt limit, so the amount of outstanding debt compared to the capacity. And as you know, the capacity is based on your equalized value. So 5% of your equalized value is what you're allowed to issue in terms of GO debt. And we'll look at a chart in a moment, but you'll see that the equalized value actually decreased from 2010 to 2011, so your capacity goes down. That is not at all uncommon. I would say the majority of our clients have seen a decrease in the equalized value, and again, given the current economy and property values, not unexpected. The percentage is at 78%, and we'll look at, I think what's important here is just looking at the trends and what you're seeing in terms of the equalized value and where you're seeing that in relation to your GO debt. And I think you'll find that the GO debt has been fairly consistent over the last 5 years, but it's important to keep an eye on what's happening at the equalized value level. Lastly, finishing out on this page with internal service funds. And this is the purpose of an internal service fund is to finance goods and services where you're, in this case, the primary items are self-insurance for health, general liability, some retiree health insurance, where you're charging the funds throughout the city for their cost associated with providing that service. And you'll see that from 2010 to 2011, the actual total net assets, so again, if you take assets less liabilities, what's left over, did go from a positive 214,000 to a deficit 739,000. And the primary driver of that was some claims experience in the self-insured health insurance fund. So that drove the decrease in net assets and actually to a deficit position. Paul and I were talking about that briefly before tonight's meeting. Again, just keeping an eye on that. It sounds like the claims experience so far for 2012 has been positive. So in terms of that deficit, the deficit has been decreasing, or the position's been getting better in 2012. Again, it's largely dependent on the type of claims experience that you have or your claims run. Those are the metrics, the key metrics. Again, I would say overall, very, very positive, good management of the budget and expenses. And in terms of the policies that you set in terms of fund balance, again, positive from a general fund perspective. No surprises, from an audit perspective. Any questions on the metrics? Otherwise, we're just going to look at some things from a graphical perspective.
Can you just help me understand a little bit better when we're running a deficit in something like the internal service fund, how is that reflected overall in terms of the fund balance, or how is that reflected in the rest of these numbers, or is it?
Sure. Right now, and I'd have to quickly take a look, but typically if there's going to be a deficit in a particular fund, and I don't know if you have the financial statements in front of you, but we can take a look at the internal service fund itself. And the health insurance fund does have, basically what's driving that is claims payable. So it just, at this point, it has some accounts receivable. It has a large amount of claims payable. So ultimately, if that fund is not able to satisfy the obligations of the fund, it would have to seek out funding from, say, the general fund in order to make up that difference. But that payable amount is what it is an estimate as well at the end of the year of what you think that claims run history is going to be. So if the premiums that you're charging the other funds ultimately aren't enough to satisfy that, typically another fund, and sometimes communities will use the general fund, other times they'll use maybe another enterprise fund to make up the funding differences or temporarily loan that fund money. But the idea with an internal service fund is it should, over the course of time, break even. And so you would need to, if you found that the claims experience was such that you anticipated or projected that deficit was going to continue, you would need to look at increasing the premiums that are charged to the various funds, and that certainly could have an impact on the budget, especially for those funds, general fund, for example, which are heavily dependent on tax levy or intergovernmental revenues, or your enterprise funds, which are largely dependent on charges for services. You may have to look at what might you need to do ultimately in terms of rates in some of the enterprise funds, and what other services maybe you'd have to cut if you were limited in terms of a levy increase. So certainly it does have the potential of impacting other funds.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay.
Okay, moving on to the next several pages, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time unless there's questions. Again, just to show you what we've been talking about in terms of a 5-year trend. In terms of fund balance, Again, the terminology has changed, but again, I think it's important that you can compare undesignated of $8.7 million in 2010 with $8.4 million in 2011. Designated of $590,000 is comparable to the $605 of assigned, and non-spendable of $1.4 is comparable to the $1.7. Again, I think you'll see that the fund balance, if you look at it in total, from 2007 to 2011, you know, it's fluctuated, but not greatly. The next is we take a look at general fund and debt service fund. And again, the debt service fund, the primary purpose is to collect tax levy dollars in order to satisfy the debt service obligations of the city. So this takes a look at, again, the revenue sources, with taxes and intergovernmental being your two largest revenue sources, which again is not a surprise. Again, this just provides in a percentage where the revenues are coming from. Moving on to expenditures, again, we like to take at what's happening in the general fund from an operating perspective, as well as we add debt service into the numbers. And you'll see last year for the first time, debt service exceeded public works. And that, again, occurred in 2011 by a slight amount. I think what's more important, though, is if you look at the next page, one percentage we take a look at, and this is something also I'm sure your financial advisors take a look at as well, and that's if you take a look at all your general fund expenditures and you include in that the amount that you pay for principal and interest related to debt service for the city funds, we like to see the amount spent in debt service under 20%. And you can see for the last 2 years that the amount spent on debt service is less than 20%. So that's another benchmark that we look at. If that starts to get over 20%, you know, then of course you're looking at, you're spending more on debt service than you are on providing services to your citizens. We talked about this briefly, and this shows your GO debt capacity, again a 5-year trend, showing your debt limit, which is the top line. And you can see in 2007 to 2008 to 2009, that number was increasing. But for 2010 and 11, again, that number has dipped back down, but not at all unexpected or contrary to what we're seeing at other communities. And you'll see then the outstanding GO debt has really hovered in that $60 million range. Any questions on, again, my focus tonight was to cover the financial highlights for the city funds. I'm going to turn it over to Jody, and she's going to cover the utilities. We've done that in the past, but we felt Jody is the senior manager. She works we segment the audit, and Jody's focus is on the utility funds. But before I do that, any questions on what we've covered so far?
I think we're okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Jody Dobson, and as Carla said, I'm a senior manager, and I focus with some of the enterprise or utility funds. So what I've got here are 4 slides, one each on the water utility, the sewer utility, the stormwater utility, and the transit operations, just to kind of touch on the financial highlights there. So starting with the water utility, we all know that the use of the utility or the sales of water is a big driver. So I like to start out with that number. And we did see a little bit of a decrease in the amount of water sold from 2010 to 2011. And that's fairly consistent with what we've seen in utilities across the state and the region. So it's a trend that we're slowly getting used to in this part of the country. But then when we look at the next number on the page here, the operating revenues, we do see an increase. And that was as a result of the rate adjustment that was put in place in December of 2010. So having those rates for the full year of 2011 allowed the utility a little bit more revenue to cover its costs. And when I look at the next line, then I'm looking at the operating expenses for the water utility. They're very flat year over year. And so that's great to commend management on the cost control efforts there, especially with some of the large costs that go into a water utility being labor, power, chemicals, things that are sometimes difficult to control costs on. So then if the third line down here we have in the finances is the operating income. And we can see a fairly strong operating income there. The next line, the non-operating items, everyone always says, well, what's all in there? It's primarily interest. So interest expense on our outstanding obligations. And then the following line we have is capital contributions. This is when we have outside parties that provide assets to the utility that the utility will then maintain going forward. And what jumped out at me here is back in 2010, we had quite a bit of things going on. So I looked back there. There were some joint projects with the city as well as some work that was financed by the town in 2010. And it's not uncommon to see that line item kind of fluctuate quite a bit from year to year based on the amount of projects or the specific projects and their financing. And then the next line down here that we have a number on is the transfer or tax equivalent that the water utility pays to the city. And the increase there is primarily due to the increase in capital investments within the water utility. That each time there's new infrastructure constructed or infrastructure that's replaced with newer infrastructure, we've got a larger base that we're calculating that number off of. So kind of looking then at the operations for the year in a nutshell, I've got two ratios here that we look at for the water utility. The first is the rate of return. The Public Service Commission of Wisconsin regulates the water utilities rates and establishes those rates to try to earn what they have as a benchmark return on their investment in capital assets. And so that last rate increase was adjusted to have just over a 5% was what they said was the target rate of return. And we can see in the last 2 years we've been a little bit above that, which is great. As you go from year to year, you're never going to hit it exactly on. And as expenses go up and down, we see that. But having that start out right away a little bit above means that we've probably, we've got some time for expenses to grow in there or capital additions to go on before we really have to worry about looking at rates again and worrying about adequacy. So that's good. And then the next item, as Carla mentioned, oftentimes the utilities have revenue debt, where we've pledged that the revenues of the charges of services will cover that debt service. And with that, there's this requirement to have a coverage factor or kind of a cushion. They want your revenues to cover all of your expenses, your debt service, and a little extra in case something unusual comes along. So for the water bonds, it's required at a 1.25, and for both the last 2 years, that's been exceeded, which is great as well. The bottom portion of the graph then here is the balance sheet or the where the utility was at year end. And what I do here is just kind of look this year compared to last year, what's changed? The unrestricted cash and investments had decreased some, and that's primarily due to capital spending. There was quite a few capital projects going on in 2011. That's also where the decrease in the next line, the restricted cash and investments. In 2010, there was some significant borrowing made where there was funds for future projects, and so those are being spent down in 2011. And then going along with that, we have the capital assets net amount that's increased. There were several main projects or distribution system projects in there, as well as the well project. The remainder of the numbers here didn't change too much from year over year. And then again, I've got a couple ratios at the bottom that we always like to look at. The first being how much is the unrestricted cash on hand for the utility. And we normally say 3 months worth of operations is a good benchmark. That allows you, if you have customers that may not pay in a timely manner, if you have an unusual maintenance expense come up, having something to kind of provide the cash flow in the interim there. The water utility at December 31st, 2011 was right about 2 months. So not too far off that target, especially with the amount of capital work that went on and the new rates just being in effect. So that's just something to monitor going forward. And then how much of the capital assets have been financed through earnings versus debt? So we look here at the water utility, and we only have about 27% through earnings, which some people may say, wow, that doesn't sound like a lot, that there's a lot of debt out there. But we have to remember your water utility is still relatively new to the city. And so the fact that it's not that old of an enterprise and there was borrowing undertaken to purchase the utility, that's not a striking number. Are there any questions on the water utility before I move on? All right, so we have very similar information here for the sewer utility. Looking at the operating revenues, we see a slight decrease here, and that's our usage pattern tends to trend with water usage for a sewer utility. However, the sewer utility has not had a rate increase for a number of years, and so that's why we see the revenues following that usage decrease. We did have a slight increase in the operating expenses in the sewer utility, and that was primarily due to some maintenance, cleaning of pipes, and repairing main breaks. And then we see this operating income, which is actually an operating loss. But what we need to remember is there's a large amount of depreciation expense or non-cash expense in those operating expenses. The non-operating item, again, is our interest expense net with our investment income. And because the sewer utility has very little debt outstanding, there's not much interest expense historically. And then we have these capital contributions. In 2011, the sewer utility was financing a project with funds through the Clean Water Fund program from the state of Wisconsin. And through that, they were able to get $386,000 of what we call principal forgiveness funds, or basically a grant funds, where you're not required to repay that amount. So that's great. That's a large portion of what's in there this year. So talking about that debt coverage ratio, we don't really have one shown here. We'll start looking at that going forward after that new Clean Water Fund loan that was taken out in 2011, but there was very little debt service on that in the current year. And then again, looking at the numbers for year end, or the balance sheet numbers for the sewer utility, the unrestricted cash and investments did increase a bit. So in spite of having an operating loss, because so much of that is driven by the non-cash depreciation expense, we were able to increase our cash and investments. All of the restricted accounts are properly funded. Those relate to any debt service accounts, as well as the DNR requires the sewer utility to maintain a replacement account, so that when mechanical equipment needs to be replaced or repaired, there's funding available for that. And then the capital assets, again, did increase. Here the largest driver was the biosolids project that's been going on. And offsetting that, the increase in long-term debt, 2 lines below, was the new Clean Water Fund loan that financed that project. So that would be the amount that actually needs to be repaid, so excluding the grant or principal forgiveness portion. So when we look at the yellow box at the bottom here, the sewer utility has just over 8 months of unrestricted cash on hand, which is a very enviable position for them to be in. What that allows you is the flexibility that as new projects come up, if the sewer utility were need to do some construction, they've got the capacity to borrow. Or they've got cash on hand to be able to finance it and can kind of choose which is the better route to go and evaluate whether either would have any impact on rates. All right. Are there any questions? Otherwise, I'll move on to the stormwater utility. All right. So the stormwater utility here is a bit smaller of an operation. Looking at our operating revenues, they were very consistent year over year. No rate increase, not a lot of change in customer accounts there. And then we look at the operating expenses, and there was actually a little bit of a decrease here, which is great. When I went back and looked at the details on this, a lot of it had to do with just the allocation of where public works employees were spending their time. A little bit less time spent in the stormwater this year based on what required maintenance or what projects were going on. And then again, the capital contributions that we have here relate to joint things that come in with street projects or put in by third parties. When we look at the balance sheet, again, our unrestricted cash and investments, the top line there, we see a significant increase, which is great. That's really building that up. And the restricted cash and investments did decrease, but as with the water utility, that's a spend down of prior borrowed funds for capital projects. So that's really what was used to fund the increase in the capital assets, which was primarily the Kruger Pond projects. And then if we look at our 2 key ratios here in the yellow box at the bottom, we've got 5 months of unrestricted cash on hand. I think the stormwater utility is a much newer fund, and it's been working up to have that, so that's a great spot to be at. And here we see a much larger portion of the capital assets have been financed over time without borrowing, whether that be through city joint funding projects or historical city assets. So another fund here that's in a good position at year end. The last fund I wanted to talk about was the transit enterprise. We did see a slight decrease in the ridership counts that we had here. However, I will always caution that when you're dealing with passes, it's really hard to say exactly how many rides did someone take on a multi-ride pass, if you have any unlimited passes in there. So we see, consistent with that, though, a slight decrease in the fares and other revenues. But the next two lines here are the ones I want to focus on, the federal operating and state operating funding. Those two numbers together make up 60% of the operating funding for the transit fund. And that's contractually what they're allowed to do, is the transit can have up to 60% of its operations funded through the state and federal grants. And I wanted to note that for 2011, you are able to claim about 99% of your maximum amount there. So that's great that you're able to fully utilize that. It is something to be aware of, that if costs were to increase substantially in the transit fund, the way those two grant programs work is you can go up to 60% or a contract maximum. So if your expenses were to go up significantly, you'd hit the contract maximum, you'd get less than 60% of the operating expenses funded through those two, and then the local portion would have to pick up the rest. So it's just something to be aware of. Then if we look at the balance sheet side on the transit utility here, it's a little bit different what we look at. We see very little in the form of cash investments of any kind. It's because all that grant funding that's on a reimbursement basis. So we need to incur the costs before we can ask the state or federal government to reimburse us for those. For that reason, it's very common for general funds or general governments to have to, on the short-term basis, finance the transit operation and then be made whole once those receivables come in, which is, if we look at the other asset line, that $900,000, a large portion of that is grant receivables at year end. And if I look down at the bottom here, as we've kind of talked about, it's not unusual to have no cash and investments in a transit fund. But the percentage of capital assets financed through earnings in a transit operation, because the federal government finances almost 80% of all capital additions, I would expect this to be around 80% minimum. And so having it over that, I know there's, in the last couple years, the transit's been able to take advantage of some of the ERA grants that were actually at 100% capital funding rather than 80%. So that's helped to bump that up a little bit. So I think, when I look at this fund, I see very stable operations, consistent from year to year. Are there any questions on any of that? All right, then I will turn it over to Joe.
Hello. As Carla mentioned, I'm going to go over the report on internal control. This report, it's pretty much in three pieces. The first being the report on internal controls, where we discuss the internal controls at the city. The second piece being some informational points on upcoming accounting and auditing standards that we'd like to put in as soon as possible, so that the city can prepare and we can help the city prepare for those developments. And the third is a required communications between the auditors and city council. So I'll start off with the report on internal control. For our audit, we consider internal control not to express an opinion on the city's internal control, but as a basis for developing our audit procedures. So we see the risks in internal control of the city, and then we design our audit tests to make sure that our audit, we can say that the financial statements are reasonably stated in all material respects. This report is fairly similar to reports that we've presented in the past, that you've seen in the past. I'm only going to go over it briefly tonight, but if you do have any questions, feel free to stop me at any time, or I can go into more detail on any of them if you wish. The first comment that I want to discuss is on page 2 of the internal control report, and that's under the category of controls over accounts payable and disbursements. In response to the fraud that the city that occurred at the city over the previous years, we took a more detailed look at some of the review procedures over disbursements and expenditures, and we looked at some of the new processes that are in place as far as additional reviews and approvals of those expenditures. So we reviewed those internal controls, and we took a sample of 38 expenditures. And we reviewed those expenditures in comparison with the new procedures and the purchasing policy. There were two occurrences that we noted here that I'll talk about in a second. But as I noted, that we did notice the city's increased review and approval process, and over all of the expenditures that we looked at, that was definitely noted. We did see those additional eyes on those expenditures, and that's really the best place to see them is at the city level, is at additional people looking and scrutinizing, and as well as city council making sure that expenditures are appropriate for the city. A couple of the instances we did see, and this can help to, discussion going forward or improvement of process forward, as we noted one purchase that requires 3 written requests for quotes, and the city maintained evidence of only 2 requests. That's not to say that a third wasn't sent out or an email out to a company for a quote, but it just wasn't maintained in the file. And then another instance of a purchase that required the city, your own regulations, to go out for bid, where we didn't see evidence of that happening. So these are a couple areas that, with increased communications to the various city departments, we can make sure that the policies of the city are adhered to on a consistent basis. And like I had said before, with those were kind of the approval of the spending at the beginning of the year for these projects. As the costs were incurred and the expenditures came through, we did review those, and the proper approvals were on the subsequent spending of those purchases. A related comment on page 3 is kind of the entity level controls. This comment had been in reports in the past, but it's a little more prominently displayed here, and this is about a risk assessment process. What this involves is the city coming together and discussing areas that could be at risk, and what does the city think that should be best and what should be done. An internal type of audit approach, so we look at some expenditures and see what's going on in a given department, or just discussion and brainstorming on where could we improve internal controls and things like that. That's all I was really going to talk about on internal controls. I can definitely take questions at this point on those.
Questions?
Well, I think I should say, I believe Mr. York's going to be presenting to us his responses to these controls. Maybe that would be the appropriate time for me to ask my questions. So I do have some specific questions about the findings.
That was included in your packet of materials that was sent out.
So will we have an opportunity to ask you questions about those?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you.
The second piece of this report is the informational points, which starts with the two-way communications regarding your audit. What this section does, it kind of discusses what an audit is, some of the processes we go through when we're out here for the audit. And I guess to point out in this piece is that we're hired by the city council to perform the audit. We work with management on a day-to-day basis, but we work for you. And if there are areas of concern, this just highlights that you'll reach out to us and ask us any questions throughout the year before our planning starts as soon as our last year's audit ends. So we're willing to discuss any of your concerns or as the year goes, so that we can plan for the next audit. It does discuss some of the upcoming accounting and auditing standards. We'll work with management to help implement those in a timely manner, so that some of these accounting and auditing standards require a great deal of work. Like Carla mentioned, the implementation of GASB 54. We sat down, we had multiple meetings with the finance department, and that transition went pretty smoothly with those communications. The last piece that I was going to talk about is the required communications with audit committee, or its equivalent. That's on page 12 of the report. What this section of the report does would outline any issues that we had with the audit, any significant accounting estimates or accounting policies. It mentions as we've just stated, the implementation of GASB 54. It outlines some of the audit adjustments that were found during the audit, difficulties, if there were any, there were not any, with this audit. And it also kind of goes in after that to some of the management's representations, what some of the things that we ask management, and they respond to us. It gives you an idea of some of the communications that we have with management. That is all I had on the report on internal controls. If there's any questions on the back half of that report either.
And if I just might spend a minute, I just want to touch on, something that Joe talked about. I'm sure many of you have heard of the fraud that occurred in the city of Dixon, Illinois. And if you haven't, I encourage you to Google that. Paul can attest to this. I presented before the Wisconsin Government Finance Officers Association, and there was probably 80 participants in the room, and the discussion was around fraud and controls and how things can go wrong. And I had everybody in the room stand up, and I said, if you've done an entity, and I talked about our responsibility of doing an audit and coming in and understanding the controls that a community has at the entity level. And one question we ask of all of our clients is, have you done a fraud risk assessment? And I asked everyone, if you've done a fraud risk assessment, stay standing. And if you haven't, please sit down. Everybody in the room sat down. I had a similar discussion at a national conference. Paul was also in attendance there. And a lot of conversations, after that meeting and about controls and, again, council's responsibility and management's responsibilities. And certainly, this was a matter that was taken very seriously by the city, but we do encourage all of our clients to have those discussions around the what can go wrong, because as was shown in Dixon, Illinois, certainly plenty of things could go wrong. Certainly what you have is a much stronger control environment with a much greater segregation of duties. But again, we encourage you, if you have concerns throughout the year, to certainly raise those concerns to us so that we can incorporate that into the planning of the audit.
Councilor DeForest, did you have a question?
Yes, I do have one question under the departmental controls. Is this the appropriate time to ask? I'm not sure with you breaking up the presentation.
No.
When is the right time?
Yep.
No, it's great.
Item 25 talks about expenses have been appropriately classified and or allocated to functions and programs in the statement of activities and made on a reasonable basis. And I bring up this point, I don't know in your familiarity in the audit how closely you looked at the golf course operations. I'm concerned that we're not seeing the debt that is being incurred by the golf course reflected anywhere in our budget. And I'm trying to figure out where that's being reflected. I've been told that right now it's an IOU against our fund balance. Do you have any sense of how we should be keeping track of those expenses in a way that we can have a more of a handle or control on what kind of debt we're actually talking about for that operation?
And just, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. You can go. I'm not familiar with the debt that you're talking about. So I guess it's kind of hard for me to speak to that. But as far as how much or we look at a given fund, it would be its relative size to the rest of the city and any significant risks that were pointed out for those different departments. So like we were talking about the communications, like if some concern came up that maybe we were not aware of, that'd be good for us to know, and we could develop that into our audit plan.
Maybe that's something you could get back to me on in terms of the deficit that the golf course is running and where that's being, I guess,
never mind,
absorbed, for lack of a better word.
Sure, and presently, and certainly I defer to management as well, but presently, other funds are advancing funds to the golf course, and we talked about the advancing of funds concept, where one fund is running short on cash, so another fund that has cash lends money to that fund. And at the end of 2011, there were funds of approximately $764,000 that were being advanced to the golf course fund. And when you have the opportunity, if you pull up the financial statements of the city, you'll find that number on page 128 of the financial statements. In the liabilities section, in the non-current liabilities, you'll see that of $764,000. And then another place that would be helpful is to take a look at one of the footnotes which describes the various interfund balances, and you'll find that on page 43.
Thank you.
And that fund presently is all being advanced by the general fund. So when we talked about the general fund having that non-spendable fund balance amount, it was over 800,000, I recall, between 8 and 900,000. $764,000 of that amount is related to the golf course advance.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
Now I know where to look for it.
Yes.
Anything else? Councilor Spreitzer.
As a follow-up to that question, what do you consider to be the best practices for dealing with a situation like that if there's not a projected revenue there that would likely begin to pay those back in the near future?
Sure, and we do have a number of clients who have those situations where, again, the internal funding source was provided. At some point in time, you need to determine whether or not that advance or those monies can be paid back. And the only way they can be paid back is if that fund, in this case the golf course, has the revenues in order to cover not only its current year cash expenditures, but also to start applying money toward that advance. Or should another fund be advancing that money, again, a fund that maybe has revenue sufficient to kind of help out or assist that fund in paying back the general fund, or ultimately is that something that the general fund forgives over a period of time. So I think it's looking at certainly projecting forward what is the future of that fund, and then looking at internally what options might be available to you in order to address that advance.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question as well related to that. Do you have a sense of it, where that threshold is, just in terms of transparency to the public, where we stop calling it in advance and start acknowledging it as a subsidy? Especially because it's coming from our general fund.
And I guess I'd probably defer to management on that. Again, I believe the financial statements as presented are transparent, but whether a citizen is going to pick up a financial statement and be able to know and understand and comprehend the inner workings of a financial statement, that is that's certainly up for discussion. So it would be through other means, whether that be through your budget process or other communications potentially.
Okay, thank you.
I'd point out that I'd say that threshold is probably something for us to decide. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Anything that you'd like to add, Mr. York?
No, unless you have any questions.
Councilor DeForest.
Thank you. Mr. York, could you speak to the finding where there was a purchase made that required a formal bid process where we don't have any evidence that that process was followed?
And what would you like to know?
Did you find that indeed was the case, or did we just miss the documentation?
One of the purchases was a generator purchased by the Public Works Department, and there was no formal bidding that took place as far as that purchase, so that finding is correct. My understanding is the second purchase that lacked the three quotes due to the specialty of the items that were being purchased. There were a limited number of vendors available, and that there were only two vendors that provided the goods that they were trying to procure. We've since instructed the departments, first of all, we reiterated to the departments the fact that they need to formally bid items over $25,000 in accordance with the city's purchasing policy. And secondly, if there are limited number of vendors available, that has to be documented for the file, the fact that the policy requires three, but three aren't available, and that needs to be documented in a manner similar to what we use for sole source procurement. There's a process set out in the policy for sole source procurement, and we've asked that the departments follow that if there's less than 3. And I might add that both of these purchases were made prior to the discovery of the fraud last year. So I don't think they found anything subsequent to the fraud that was discovered about a year or so ago.
Okay, and then, thank you. Regarding the risk assessment process, I noticed in your management response, let me find that, that you stated the city will work with the auditors to develop a risk assessment process.
Yes.
But there's no specifics about what that will look like or how that, can you give us a little bit more information?
Well, we haven't had an opportunity to meet with them yet.
So we'll receive a report on that at some point?
Once we develop our procedures, we'll pass that on to the council.
I would appreciate that. And then related to departmental controls, I understand, given our level of staffing, that for many of the areas where we are collecting money, we're not able to segregate duties. Do we have a policy in place in the city in terms of what's the threshold of money collected where we decide we really need to try to segregate the duties for some of these? I know, for example, like a concessions at Riverside, we're obviously not going to be doing that, but maybe some of our larger enterprises where there's a more significant number of cash intake, do we have a policy in effect for that?
There are cash handling procedures that have been established by the city treasurer's office, and those are implemented throughout the city. And the city treasurer actually does cash audits at these various locations throughout the year to verify that procedures are being followed.
Does she get to all of the
Yes.
areas every year?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, sorry, a couple more. The very last comment about preparing and implementing a corrective action plan for each audit finding, is that something that will be an addendum to the audit materials, or is that something that we can look for later at some point?
Our corrective action plan are the comments that we submitted on the internal control findings.
Okay. So if we want more specifics, that would be something we would just need to communicate with your department about to find out.
Certainly.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
Mr. President, I was just going to quickly comment. I'm not sure we gave it a label or that we knew it had a label, but last summer after we discovered the thefts in water resources, the city undertook an extensive analysis of all of our internal operating procedures, all of our purchasing and related policies were thoroughly reviewed. We retrained employees. We tightened up internal review processes. We went to P-card purchasing systems to get away from these open accounts. So we did an extensive risk analysis last summer, and we didn't have to change a lot of our policies, but we needed to tighten up the review procedures, and that was done last year. The P-card system was implemented. So I'm not sure we called it anything or gave it a name, but we went through that process literally starting from scratch with every employee involved in every step of the purchasing process, every city policy, every internal control that's available through the finance operation as well.
Thank you, Manager Arft. I'd also like to point out to my fellow councilors that the one point that was brought up, the generator issue, I believe that was handled with tremendous alacrity, not only by this body, by management. Of the 3 people involved, none of them work for the city at this moment. So, and some are wards of the federal government. We need say nothing more about that, but that was definitely handled strongly. And I appreciate the energy that you and Mr. York brought to handling those issues and putting this behind us, hopefully permanently. All right. Any other councilor questions or comments? All right then. What action do we need to take on the audit?
Just a note to receive and file it.
Okay.
A motion from the file that you received it, heard the presentation, and file the report.
All right. Any motion to accept the audit report?
Second.
Lukey and Levy, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes 6-0. All right. Finally, item 11A. Madam Clerk?
A resolution authorizing the application and borrowing of up to $100,000 from the State of Wisconsin Board of Commissioners of Public Lands State Trust Fund Loan Program for the projects contained in the 2012 capital improvements budget.
All right, entertain a motion.
Motion for acceptance.
Oh, well, all right, okay, exactly. Sorry about that, Paul. This has been that was.
Hey, it's fine with me if you want to go ahead and vote.
All right, we're good to go. Let's go. Let's have your presentation, sir.
Well, I'll be very brief. This actually concludes our financing plan for the 2012 capital budget.
That's okay. We're getting anxious.
The state trust fund loan is made up of a number of small projects that were not included, along with the financings that we did earlier, which were primarily for construction-related projects. These are primarily small public works projects. It also includes some equipment for our police department, which we were informed by our bond counsel earlier that we could not include those along with our general obligation issue that we intended to do in the spring. There's some state statute requirement that that's not permitted. So we did include that with the state trust fund borrowing. The total amount is $377,000, and the plan is to finance this for 5 years at an interest rate of 2.5%. And I might add the state trust fund just recently lowered their interest rate, so this is the lower rate that they're currently offering. And with that, I'll be glad to answer any particular questions you may have regarding the financing.
Okay, now we can go ahead and get a motion. Okay, Lubke?
Second.
Spreitzer seconding. Okay, now any councilor comments or questions? All right, hearing none, we'll call the matter. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Item passes 6-0. All right, and item 11B.
A resolution releasing right of first refusal for 348 Locust Street.
Councilor DeForest has to recuse herself for this one. And City Attorney.
Thank you, Mr. President. Back in 2004, the city owned a property at 348 Locust Street. My understanding is the city had earlier acquired that with some anticipation of redevelopment and remarketing it. We were approached around that time by the Family Services Association. They had a desire to acquire the property and use it as a shelter for victims of domestic violence. The city council approved that transaction. The property was sold to Family Services at that time for $5,000. At the same time, the city executed the deed to Family Services. A separate document was recorded whereby the city reserved the right of first refusal to reacquire the property for the same $5,000 at any future point in time that Family Services wished to market the property and obviously cease making use of it for its intended purpose at the time of the transaction. Family Services has indicated to us that they are now at that point and has requested that the city consider waiving its right of first refusal. In order for them to market the property to someone else, the city would have to either refuse to exercise it or waive it. Staff recommends that we grant that waiver. It would entail your authorization to the city manager for him to execute a quitclaim deed, which would forever and unequivocally release them from that obligation to give us the first shot at the property, if you will. As was discussed in the agenda meeting, if council isn't comfortable with doing that and wishes to direct the city to proceed otherwise and exercise it, that is certainly an available option. But given the current marketing conditions and the other city inventory, staff did not oppose the request from Family Services. So with that, I'll open myself to any questions you might have. And
Do we have a motion to approve the resolution?
Make a motion that the city releases its right to first refusal.
Second. Moved Key and seconded by Levy. Any questions? Councilor Spreitzer.
If we did exercise our option here and purchased it and then attempted to sell the property, what fund would we be buying it from, and what fund would be benefiting from that? Would that just be the general fund, or would that be a specific?
I think I'd have to defer to the manager. I'm not sure if we've thought through what fund we'd take the money from.
We would have to research that, to be perfectly honest with you. That was transaction occurred just before my arrival in the city, and I'm not sure whether there was a special fund set up for managing that real estate at that time, or whether it was just being done as part of the general fund. I believe they were acquired with city funds, not with the community development or any other HUD funding source. So my best guess tonight would be that the money would come back to the general fund. I think that was one of the comments that Family Services made. If they could sell this at something resembling market value today, they would have those funds available to use for programming for the agency. Our concern with getting it back is we've got 3 on the market and 4 more coming online before the end of the year, and that doesn't count the 9 units of public housing that we would love to sell. When you add that up, we'll have over 15 single-family homes available for sale in the next few months. And our experience has not been the best. In the last 3 years, we've been able to sell 1. That's why we were not real enamored with grabbing another one and putting it in the inventory.
And a follow-up, we consider the property in good enough shape that if it does sell, it's not likely to become a problem in the neighborhood?
No, I'll be honest with you, I didn't go over and go through it. Maybe I should have done that. I looked at it from the outside. It's in pretty decent condition. So no, I don't think it's anything that would be a derelict or in any way would detract from the overall quality of the neighborhood.
Thank you.
I myself, it seems to, Councilor Kincaid.
Oh yes, absolutely. This is zone single family. It could be used as a rental, but single family only, could not be converted to a duplex or a multi-unit rental unit. So it would be either a single family owner occupancy or a single family rental. And there are some institutional uses, as was the case with Family Services, that are also allowed in these single family neighborhoods. But that's basically it.
They vacated the property already.
John, do you have anybody in there, or you're completely out of the property at this point?
It's currently
Unoccupied.
Okay. Personally, I think we've expended, we've got too many of our fingers out there already. I can't see us wanting to take on another project personally. Councilman.
And I echo that, and I feel very comfortable in allowing Family Service to dispose of this because the money will go back to helping Beloiters, and they have done a wonderful job in helping people in need in Beloit for many years, and it would just encompass that work to a greater degree.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? All right, hearing none, I'll call the question. All in favor of this resolution, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Item passes 5-0 with one abstention. All right. Yes, absolutely. Wouldn't want to adjourn without you, Councilman Forrest.
You might object.
In that case, I'll make the motion.
All right. Okay, all in favor of adjourning, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Great, we are adjourned. Thank you.